So if you'll take your Bibles and turn to Hebrews chapter 11 once again, we've come to the last section of what they, in a sense, what they call the Hall of Faith. There's a little bit more to it, but it's sort of all jumbled together. This is the last sort of individual, or where specific deeds or events are mentioned. We're actually going to be in just two verses today, 29 and 30. I'd originally planned to go to verse 31, and then as I was trying to relate each of these events together. Think about the theme that the writer of Hebrews is giving us, and it just seemed too hard to put them all together into one theme. So next week we will plan to talk about Rahab, which I think really is quite unique in the whole list, and it will be something that speaks to us very directly now in our situation in our faith in Christ. Most of us, I think almost all of us, are Gentiles or of Gentile extraction. So Rahab certainly speaks to us about that. We'll be looking at her next time, Lord willing. Now, this list is meant to encourage wavering believers to endure, to continue in the faith despite great temptation to the contrary. And on our title slide here in our PowerPoint, I have the theme, Stay Faithful to Christ, on Hebrews here. And I see my font has messed up on me, but anyway, I don't know. I don't understand computers sometimes. All right, but anyway, stay faithful to Christ. I've had that as the theme of the book right from the beginning, and really that is what it's all about. The enduring faith. We see it again and again emphasized here in Hebrews chapter 11. Now, in our passage today, we are looking at a collective enduring faith, the faith of a group rather than the faith of an individual. We've had the faith of Abel, of Noah, of, let's see, maybe I should look back. Let's see, faith, Enoch. I missed Enoch. I knew I was missing somebody. That was throwing me off. The faith of Abraham, the faith of Sarah. We've had Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. We've had Moses, all individuals. Now we're going to look at the people of God and their faith as they go forward for God. The two examples for us today, and I'm just going to switch to the text. I'm going to read it in just a bit, but the two examples are the crossing of the Red Sea and the defeat of Jericho. It is interesting to note, one of the commentaries notes, that this is all that we have of the Exodus in this record. The author obviously can't just write about everything that happened in Israel, and there were faithful deeds and faithful actions during the wilderness wanderings, and yet it is these two things that are sort of at the bookends. They were both triumphant. In the middle, there was a lot of defeat. But it is these two things that mark the beginning of the Israelite nation, and so we're going to be looking about this. These events also, we see that the people are following the faith of a God-anointed leader in both of these events. Moses is leading, of course, as they cross the Red Sea. Joshua is leading as they defeat Jericho. But in both of these situations, as noted, and as we'll read in a moment, the author does not emphasize the leader, but the people. A couple other things to note here about these two events. At the Red Sea, the people were desperate. And at Jericho, I kind of think the people were bewildered. We'll talk about why I think so in just a bit. But in both situations, the people had to follow leaders who seemed to them doing things that were crazy, or calling them to do something that was crazy. And it is one thing to make a faithful decision when you are the only one impacted. If you alone have to stand up for your faith, you might summon up the courage to step forward. But what if your forward step makes no sense? And to pile up on that, what if your forward step affects your family and your little ones, and you wonder what's going to happen to them? That is the test the people of God are seeing in these occasions, I think. What if you think loyalty to God is completely incomprehensible? Again, this is what we'll see. I think when we tell lost people about the gospel, we're out in the world, we have maybe friends or acquaintances or just even somebody we meet, and we begin a gospel conversation. And they look at us, I think, in many cases, as people who we're a little bit off, a little bit weird, a little bit, strange, and it makes no sense to them. And in a sense, because they come from a totally different perspective, I can understand that feeling. But when a believer must make a hard faith decision to follow God, what then? So that is what we're going to ask as we look at our text today. So Hebrews 11, verses 29 to 30. By faith they passed through the Red Sea as though they were passing through dry land. And the Egyptians, when they attempted it, were drowned. Amazing statement. By faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. Those are the two statements that we're looking at today. And so my proposition, when faith makes no sense, faith is the only thing that makes sense. And that proposition doesn't make a lot of sense until you hear the rest of the message. Okay, so let's move on in this. Desperation at the Red Sea is my first point. You're going to need to turn to Exodus 14. There's too many verses there for me to get through just putting it on the screen. So if you've got your Bible or you got your phone, you can look. That's so funny. I think about when I was going to school. Somebody said, "Take out your phone." People say, "What?" They don't even know what they're talking about. Okay, phones were fixed to walls back in those days. All right, and that was just after you got off the ark. That was the deal. But anyway, okay. So desperation at the Red Sea. So we're going to be in Exodus 14. I'll get to some of the verses in just a second. But here we want to make some notes. I'm going to give you a map in just a second here. But the first thing to note, well, maybe I should give you the map, is where Israel was living. Now, Israel was living in the delta region of Egypt. That is where Goshen was. We see that name in the Bible. You see a couple of cities noted here, and I got a couple of arrows and lines on the map. I didn't make these. I copied this off of my Logos software. But this is suggestions for the route of the Exodus. I think most of them are actually probably incorrect. Okay, but that's what they have in this map, and I wanted to show it to you for a couple of reasons. All right, so it gives you a sense of it. You see the Mediterranean Sea up above. You see the delta of the Nile sort of in the left center, and then down at the bottom, at the very tip, is what we would call the Gulf of Suez, that part of the Red Sea, where I think probably they crossed, or maybe that lower red line is where they crossed, and the Gulf of Suez perhaps at that time extended further. We don't know. Anyway, let's read a couple of verses here. So verse 2, Exodus 14:2. The Lord spoke, verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Tell the sons of Israel to turn back and camp before Pi-hahiroth." I'm not quite sure how you say that. I said it pretty good. I'm sure I did. Okay, between Migdol and the sea. You shall camp in front of Baal-zephon, opposite by the sea. Now, the point of this is that wherever they started, which, if I can turn on my pointer, is somewhere over here in this region. And they came down somewhere. They either came here, that seems a little bit off to me, or here, or even down here. Now this is something that to Pharaoh would not make sense. They are supposedly heading out into the wilderness, but they have gotten themselves against the sea. The term in our Bible in Exodus does not identify which sea according to modern maps. In fact, it's very not surprising. They didn't know what the modern names were. They had their own names for it. And so they're camped beside a sea. As we look at the book of Numbers, we think there's roughly or maybe we should say at least 2 million people in the company of Israel. You can count the number of warriors. I think if I remember right, it was somewhere around 800 and some thousand in Israel at the time, at the very beginning of Numbers. And that's right at this point, at the Exodus. And so that means of those numbers, these are men between 20 and I forget what the upper range was, maybe 60, something like that. They were in the army, or at least capable of serving in the army. And that would mean that most of them would have families. They would have wives. They would have parents who might be a bit older. They would have children who would obviously be below that number, below the years of 20. So a rough estimate is at least 2 million people, maybe more. Think about how big that camp must have been. And they have set out, and Egypt has been devastated, and they are on their way, and they seem to not know where they are going. Because as you notice in verse 3, God says, "For Pharaoh will say of the sons of Israel, they are wandering aimlessly in the land. The wilderness has shut them in. Thus I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will chase after them, and I will be honored through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord." And it says, and they did so. So what is God doing? He's setting a trap for Pharaoh. That's what he's doing. And God tells this to Moses. As you noted, they're camping at a place called Pihahiroth. I should have practiced that before I started preaching. And then it's also in front of Baal Zephon. We don't know at all where either of those places are. And of course, there's no archaeological remains. They were just in the wilderness. According to the things I read about this area of Egypt, the Egyptians didn't typically live in these regions. They were regions that were good for flocks, as Goshen was, and the Egyptians were not herdsmen. We know that according to the ancient records and according to the Old Testament. So you see the name Pihahiroth here and here and here with a question mark. What that tells you is nobody knows. They don't know where it is. But the point is that they're beside a body of water that is called the sea. Now, I began to look at these to try to determine what they are. This is called Lake Bala up here. This one is called Lake Timsah. This is the greater Bitter Lake, and just at the bottom here is the lesser Bitter Lake, and then down here, the current Gulf of Suez. Now, as I mentioned, it is possible that the Gulf of Suez extended further north. This is lowland here. According to, I went on the internet to find out if this was true or not. I just had the idea. And I was amazed. They do say, yes, the Gulf of Suez probably was. Geologists say this. But that was millions of years ago, according to them. Well, they're wrong. Couldn't have been millions of years ago. But the point is that it could have extended further north. We don't know for certain. Now we're going to skip down to verse 10. I want you to look there. The Egyptians, verse 9, the Egyptians chased after them. Verse 10, as Pharaoh drew near, the sons of Israel looked, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they became very frightened. And so the sons of Israel cried out to the Lord. Now, in verse 7 it says, Pharaoh had 600 chariots, and plus his army. Now, chariots were the weapon of war, the primary weapon of war in that era. They were very fearsome. These men mounted on their chariots, coming thundering after them, the marching armies approaching them. Apparently, as you know, the pillar of fire by night, the pillar of cloud by day, the presence of God, was leading them as they went through the wilderness. But at this point, it is before them, it is not behind them. And so as they look behind, they see the dust clouds coming. Someone spies chariots. Someone sees the marching formations of armies. And what is the reaction of the people? There is nowhere to go. There's the armies coming and the water before them. So let's see. 11, then they said to Moses, is it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you dealt with us in this way, bringing us out of Egypt? So there they are. They are trapped, nowhere to go. So I began to do a little further research and just trying to see about these bodies of water. The Gulf of Suez, this is current statistics from the very accurate Wikipedia. So you know that's must be true. Anyway, so it's between 12 and 20 miles across. Maximum depth is 230 feet. Now, I don't know exactly, if they made it to the Gulf of Suez, I don't know exactly where they crossed, but that's the statistics for now. Just by comparison, the Strait of Juan de Fuca is between 12 and 25 miles across. The average depth, a little bit more, 330 feet. So it's deeper. Now, if you go out to Dallas Road and you look across to Port Angeles, you would be basically looking at the Gulf of Suez in terms of distance. Okay, you think about that. You're standing there on the edge of the cliff on Dallas Road. You got an army marching towards you, and you say, what are we going to do now? Right? There's the water in front of you. What are you going to do? We don't have boats. And this army is coming. And we know they're not happy. Okay? Now, the Great Bitter Lake, which is this one here, currently itself is about 8 miles across. That's far enough. That's about half the Juan de Fuca Strait. Its maximum depth is 92 feet. That's deep enough too. Okay, like basically, I'm not a fan of water. I feel the ferries are too small, and I get nervous. I don't like to stand by the edge. I like to just sort of stay inside and not look at anything. That's the thing. We were over on the other day, my brother and I, and the captain said, oh, there's humpback whales over on whatever side. I'm not looking. I'm staying where I am. Okay? No, I'm not a fan of water. But this is where they are. They're standing by the water. What are we going to do? Okay? Now, we don't know exactly where this crossing happened, but I want you to notice, let's look down to verse 22, because there's an important fact in verse 22. It says, the sons of Israel went through the midst of the sea on the dry land. This is what our verse is echoing back in Hebrews. And the waters were like a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. Now, it had to be a fairly wide canyon of water. But on the right hand, there's water. On the left hand, there's water. This isn't some liberal scholars who come to the Bible say, oh, well, I think the word in Hebrew means reed. So they say this is the Reed Sea, and well, actually, this is this marshy land up here. And they got all excited, and they wanted to make out that it was some super miracle. They're trying to deny the miracle aspect of it. But I don't know how in a shallows you have a wall of water on one side and a wall of water on the other side. That doesn't make sense. And I don't know how, after the fact, you drown Pharaoh's army, 600 chariots and however many marching men, in a shallow body of water. Doesn't make sense. All right? So there's a lot of things where liberals try to attack this record. And we're going to leave Israel here with verse 11. I already read. Is it because there were no graves? In verse 11. Then verse 12. Is this not the word we spoke to you in Egypt, saying, leave us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. All right, so what they're saying is, Moses, we told you, don't mess with Pharaoh. Let us stay in our slavery. We don't want to risk it, is what they're saying. All right, so they're afraid, obviously. Now we're going to leave Exodus 14 and leave Israel afraid because we need to move on to our next point, which comes from verse 30, the bewilderment in front of Jericho. So for this, you need to turn over to Joshua. So we're skipping all over the Pentateuch, get to Joshua, and we're going to be looking at chapters 5 and 6. Mostly 6, but 5 does come into it. So get to the end of 5, and that's where you want to be. So bewilderment in front of Jericho. Well, the walls of Jericho. I was reading on this a little bit as well. The walls of Jericho has been inhabited off and on for thousands of years, literally. Hasn't been inhabited continually, but it has been inhabited off and on. Its location is strategic, above the Dead Sea, and I'll give you a map of that as well. So here's the map. Okay, here's the top of the Dead Sea. Here's Jericho. Over here is Sittim. Okay, this is where the children of Israel were camped before they crossed the Jordan. Again, the waters parted. That's not part of our story for today. They're camped here above Jericho, and they're going to besiege Jericho. All right, that's the plan. But archaeology cannot tell us much. We do know that the city was built and fortified before Joshua's time. There is some talk, there was years ago, an archaeologist had found evidence of destruction, and he thought it was from the time of Joshua. Later studies have shown that he was incorrect. His dating was incorrect. However, it says in the reading I did, there is evidence of much erosion and damage by the elements at different periods of building and rebuilding. And there was a point at which, after Joshua defeated Jericho, he laid a curse on Jericho, and he said, "No one shall rebuild it without the cost of their own child's life," if you remember that part of the book of Joshua. And in fact, the city of Jericho, although people still inhabited the region, and sometimes the region would be referred to by that name, the city of Jericho lay in ruins for 400 years. Until the time of Ahab. All right, so there were ample time in that for those ruins after Joshua's conquest, for the ruins to wash away and be eroded because of the topography of Jericho. I have a quote here from one of the Bible dictionaries. It says, "It seems highly likely that the washed out remains of the last late Bronze Age city, the city of Joshua, or during Joshua's time, are now lost under the modern road and the cultivated land along the east side of the town mound." Okay, there's a pile there that people kept building on. "As the main slope of the mound is from west down to east, it remains highly doubtful whether excavation here, even if allowed, would yield much now." In other words, the walls of Jericho are lost, literally, to the sands of time by erosion. But we do know the record in the Bible. So what is the Lord's directions? For this, we want to look at chapter 5 of Joshua and we're going to, let's see. Do you know what? Yes, that's where I want. Okay. I want to start at verse 13. "Now it came about when Joshua was by Jericho that he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing opposite him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, 'Are you for us or for our adversaries?' He said, 'No, rather I indeed come now as captain of the hosts of the Lord.' And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and bowed down and said to him, 'What has my Lord to say to his servant?' The captain of the Lord's host said to Joshua, 'Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy.' And Joshua did so." So this, of course, reminds us of the burning bush. Just as God appeared to Moses at the burning bush, here now this figure of a warrior stands before Joshua, and he is confronting Joshua. Now, he gives his battle plan in the next few verses in chapter 6. "Now Jericho was tightly shut because of the sons of Israel, and no one went out and no one came in. The Lord said to Joshua, 'See, I have given Jericho into your hand with its king and the valiant warriors. You shall march around the city, all the men of war circling the city once. You shall do so for 6 days.'" So they were to gather the army, the fighting men. They were to assemble. They were to march. And it says, verse 4, "Also 7 priests shall carry 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark." They're to bring the ark of the covenant. "Then on the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. It shall be that when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, and when you hear the sound of the trumpet, All the people shall shout with a great noise, with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat, and the people will go up, every man straight ahead. All right, so that's God's battle plan. All the people, all the fighting men to march around the city every day for 6 days. Now we find later on that in fact, the trumpets were blowing during this time. There's an order of march. I'm not sure if I put this in here. I guess we did. I will read a little bit more in just a bit. On the 7th day in the plan, they were to march 7 times. I don't know what the circumference of Jericho was, but this must have been quite a sight. Here they come. The people, you're standing on the wall of Jericho, and you're watching this army approach. But they don't set up ramps. They don't try to assault the walls. They don't do what you expect. Instead, they turn and they began to march around the city. And the men are silent, but the trumpets are blowing once around. First day. Next morning you get up and here's this army again, and it's doing the same thing. It's got to be mysterious. Third day, same thing. Marching around, looking at these battlements, all the soldiers, all armed, all marching around the city. The trumpets blowing. Then you go the 4th day, same thing. 5th day, same thing. 6th day, same thing. 7th day, they're there again. Except this time they go around, and they go around, and they go around, and they're going 7 times. It's got to be bewildering. And something, on the 7th day, with all of that activity, that must speak to them that something is going on. Now, the text does not say that Joshua relayed all this information of the plan to the people. We'll just look at his instructions beginning in verse 6. So Joshua the son of Nun called the priests and said to them, "Take up the ark of the covenant, and let 7 priests carry 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord." Then he said to the people, "Go forward and march around the city, and let the armed men go on before the ark of the Lord." And it was so, that when Joshua had spoken to the people, the 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets of the ram's horns before the Lord went forward and blew the trumpets, and the ark of the covenant of the Lord followed them. The armed men went before the priests who blew the trumpets, and the rear guard came after the ark while they continued to blow the trumpets. So the procession is armies in front, the Ark of the Covenant and the priests with the trumpets, and then armies behind. Okay, so that's the pattern. All right, and then verse 10. But Joshua commanded the people, saying, "You shall not shout, nor let your voice be heard, nor let a word proceed out of your mouth until I tell you, shout, then you shall shout." Okay, now think about that. Think about that display. These armies marching around, silent. In these types of battles, my understanding is they try to instill fear in their enemies by making wild cries. In the Civil War, they talk about the rebel yell, which is what the Southern armies had. Now, I have no idea what it was. I've never heard a rebel yell, and I don't necessarily care to. But these are silent armies marching around the city. The first day, verse 11, so he had the ark of the Lord taken around the city, circling it once, and they came into the camp and spent the night in camp. And then we go, verses 12 to 14, the second through the 6th day. Now Joshua rose up early in the morning, and the priests took up the ark of the Lord. The 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord went on continually and blew the trumpets. And the armed men went before them, and the rear guard came after the ark of the Lord, while they were continued to blow the trumpets. Thus the 2nd day they marched around the city once and returned to the camp. They did so for 6 days. All right, so a couple of comments here as we think about them marching around this city, around and around and around, 6 days in a row. We're going to stop with them at this point as well, but I have a couple of, or at least one quote. The people's faith, this is F.F. Bruce, the people's faith was involved, for they carried out faithfully the instructions which Joshua communicated to them until the city fell. But they could not see how it would fall. On the face of it, nothing could seem more foolish than for grown men to march around a strong fortress for 7 days on end, led by 7 priests blowing ram's horns. Who ever heard of a fortress being captured that way? Okay, so our point here, our second point is bewilderment. Bewilderment. Remember, my overall proposition is that when faith makes no sense, faith is the only thing that makes sense. Right? So bewilderment. We have desperation at the Red Sea. We have bewilderment in front of Jericho. Now, here I want to camp on that word, bewilderment. There are times when following God doesn't make sense from everything we know about life and how things work. Circumstances come into your life and you know what the right thing to do is. It may not be a moral question. It means a thing that you know what God wants you to do. But it doesn't make sense. Why me? Why do I have to be the one to do this? Why does God want to lead me in this way? Why is God making this choice? It's very bewildering. It can be frightening. You can be put into a desperate situation where you have no choice. The children of Israel at the Red Sea had no choice. They couldn't go back. They had to go forward. How are we going to go forward? Can we swim that? Some of us might. Some of them might have been able to swim 20 miles. That's quite a ways. Think about that. We've had people swimming across the Juan de Fuca. We've heard of people swimming across the English Channel. Okay, now why you would do that? Again, this water thing. I have no idea. It makes no sense to me at all. I hope God never calls me to do that. Okay? All right, that would just make no sense. Desperation on the one hand, or bewilderment. All right, so the next point, the last point is the triumph of the first step. So, with God instructions now, Moses prayed and God said, move forward. There they are, camped before the sea. It would take some time for the camp to break up. You got 2 million or so people. They've got to pull down their tents. They've got to pack things up. They've got to get their pack animals, such as they have, together. They've got to get their flocks and herds together. They've got to get a line of march. They've got to assemble into some kind of order. It's going to take some time. In the meantime, as we read in Exodus 14, we will find that God interposed his cloud between Pharaoh and Israel to confuse Pharaoh, to illumine the night for Israel and give Israel some protection. Then it seems that Moses prayed, and God said, I'm going to put this on the screen. Oops, where we go? There we go. Then the Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the sons of Israel to go forward. There, think about that statement. There's the water. Tell the sons of Israel to go forward. As for you, lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, and the sons of Israel shall go through the midst of the sea on dry land. All right, so that's the instruction. And we know the instructions for Jericho. March in silence for 6 days. Okay, march in silence for 6 days. Then blow the blast and shout after the 7th circuit on the 7th day. Now that one's not so fearful, but it is weird. It is bewildering. What does God want us to do? All right, so Israel's response. This is the nation under Moses. What did they do? They stepped into the sea. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord swept the sea back by a strong east wind all night and turned the sea into dry land. So the waters were divided. The sons of Israel went through the midst of the sea on the dry land, and the waters were like a wall to them on the right hand and on the left. I don't know exactly what this was like. It says the wind blew all night. Now, some of the commentaries have talked about this, and they say it's not really. This is when God divides the water like that. There's going to be a wind because there's a displacement of the mass of the water, so the air will rush in to fill that displacement. Now, was And if the wind was such that it could divide the water by itself, simply by using the wind, God using the wind, how could you walk in that kind of a wind? Okay, so that doesn't make sense. So I have a sense, when we read about the crossing of Jordan later on, the priest led the way across the Jordan. You remember? They said, go across the Jordan. There's the water. And as the priest lifted his foot by the water divided. I have a sense that as Moses held out his rod and said to the people, all right, forward, and he's holding out the rod, and as the first advanced leaders of Israel start by faith to follow God's commands, the water begins to divide. And they say, wait a minute, I thought I was right next to the water. It's another 20 yards, and they keep moving. And the water keeps dividing, and as they put their feet down, they're not walking in mud. They're walking in dry land. And God makes a way for them through the waters. The first step is where the maximum faith was required. After that, as I've joked before, I can imagine little boys on the edge of the crowd throwing in fishing lines sideways into the water. Right? I mean, here they are. It's just amazing. This towering water on either side, and God's making a way. And the fear turns to joy, and they get across. You know the rest of the story. We're not going to talk about that. Let's talk about Jericho. So the people shouted, verses 20 and 21. This is the end of the seventh time around. And the priest blew the trumpets. And when the people heard the sound of the trumpets, the people shouted with a great shout. And the wall fell down flat, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight ahead, and they took the city. They utterly destroyed everything in the city, both man and woman, young and old, and ox and sheep and donkey, with the edge of the sword, except Rahab, of course. Okay? What a story. Here they are. They have been commanded. This is weird. Walking around the city. Silent, silent, silent. Walking around the city. Walking around 7 times on the 7th day. And then they hear that long blast of the ram's horn. They hear the voice of Joshua saying, shout now. And they shout, and the walls fall flat. Okay. So what is the emphasis of Hebrews? As we look at our text in Hebrews, it says, by faith they crossed the Red Sea. And by faith the walls of Jericho fell. In neither verse is an individual name. This is the faith of the people. And what is the lesson of faith? When faith makes no sense, faith is the only thing that makes sense. At the Red Sea, my commentary says, the action of the people in crossing the sea indicates they shared the faith of Moses. At the critical moment, they demonstrated that they were prepared to attempt the impossible at the command of God. The declaration that they acted by faith has specific reference to the command of God in Exodus 14:15 to go forward. The deliverance that had been procured for them could be appropriated only through the response of faith. Now, before Jericho, faith in this instance consisted in the readiness to act in accordance with God's mandate. It was expressed by Joshua, the priest, and the company of fighting men. From a military standpoint, the assurances that a great walled city could be taken simply by encircling it for 7 days, the silence broken only by the muffled tramp of feet, the sounding of ram's horns, and a loud shout on the 7th day must have seemed remote from reality. But the people complied with the instructions God had given, and their faith was rewarded. And so, as I say, when faith makes no sense, faith is the only thing that makes sense. Now, before I close, I want to make one notation. We need to note that we are not talking about presumption here. Okay, what is presumption? Well, an example of presumption is when the devil took Jesus to the pinnacle of the temple and said, throw yourself down because God has said he will not allow you to harm the sole of your feet and an angel will take care of you. I'm paraphrasing. That would be presumptuous. Jesus said, you shall not tempt the Lord your God. Sometimes people will do things and they say, oh, I have faith, and it's not that it just makes no sense. There is no objective reason they can say that God has told them to do that. We're not talking about presumption here. Here in this book, the book of Hebrews, the issue is, should we abandon Christianity and go back to Judaism because it's safer? It makes sense for it to be safer. We'll still be worshiping the true God. It's safer. But what God is saying is stay the course. Keep your testimony. Don't give up. Don't abandon Christ for anything. We live in a world that puts a lot of pressure on Christianity. It might make sense to keep quiet. It might make sense to hide yourself away. It might make sense to not identify yourself as a Christian, but God says, he who is ashamed of me, I'll be ashamed of him. Right? Okay. Obeying these commands is no presumption. It is faith. It is enduring faith. We're challenged in our walk in many ways. We know the right thing to do, but we waver because we are weak individuals. We are weak men and women. We are tempted to take the easier way. The way of faith is to trust God even when it doesn't make sense. Let's bow our heads for a word of prayer. Our Father, we pray that you would stir in us that enduring faith that follows your commands, that obeys your words, even when the pressure of the world makes this seem so hard, so wrong, so foolish. Lord, I pray that you would help us to endure as your servants. In Jesus' name, amen.